The sound of the front door closing sent a sharp jolt through me, and my grip tightened around the ceramic coffee mug in my hands. The house had been quiet all evening, the kind of silence I'd grown used to, the kind that settled in after years of routine. My husband had texted earlier that he'd be working late again, so the last thing I expected was the sound of someone stepping inside. For a brief moment, my mind scrambled for logical explanations. Had he changed his mind and come home early? Or maybe it was just the wind. But then I heard the soft rustling of fabric, the shuffle of shoes being kicked off near the doorway. Someone was here. The realization sent my pulse into an erratic rhythm as I moved cautiously toward the hallway, my sock-covered feet making no sound against the hardwood floor. The dim lighting cast long shadows, but as I stepped closer, the figure became clear. It wasn't my husband. It was him. Tall, lean, and entirely at ease, he stood by the coat rack, shaking the rain from his hair, acting as if this house was just as much his as it was mine. His bag, carelessly slung over one shoulder, dropped onto the floor with a dull thud. He didn't even look surprised to see me standing there, gripping my coffee as if it were an anchor. Instead, he smiled, that same confident smirk that had made me uneasy since the moment he arrived. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, his voice low, effortless, as if he already knew I'd been caught off guard. I swallowed hard, forcing my face into something neutral, something controlled. "I wasn't expecting you tonight." My words came out more clipped than I intended, but I needed to set boundaries, needed to remind both of us that his presence here was temporary. "Last-minute change," he said with a shrug, brushing past me as he walked deeper into the house, dragging the scent of rain and aftershave along with him. "Didn't think you'd mind." I minded. Not because he was here, he had every right to be, but because something about him unsettled me in a way I couldn't name. He had only been staying with us for a short time, yet he moved through our home with a confidence that felt almost invasive, as if he had already memorized every inch of it. I turned back toward the kitchen, needing something to do, some excuse to put distance between us. My hands trembled slightly as I set my mug down on the counter. I heard his footsteps behind me, not heavy, not rushed, just present. "You always stay up this late?" he asked, pulling open the fridge without hesitation as if he'd lived here forever. "Or just tonight?" His tone was teasing, but there was something else there, something unreadable. I forced a small, polite smile, though my stomach twisted with unease. I wasn't tired. Why? I had been exhausted before he walked through that door, but now sleep was the last thing on my mind. He grabbed a bottle of water, twisted the cap off, and leaned casually against the counter, watching me. The weight of his gaze was impossible to ignore. I busied myself wiping an already clean spot on the counter, pretending I didn't notice. But I did. Always did. Silence stretched between us, thick with something unspoken. I wasn't sure if I imagined it or if he felt it too. It wasn't tension in the obvious sense, not hostility, not discomfort, just an awareness that neither of us acknowledged. He took a slow sip of his water, his eyes never leaving mine, and I suddenly felt hyper-aware of everything. The way my breath came a little too fast, the way my skin prickled under his attention. I needed to leave the room, needed to put some kind of barrier between us. "I should head to bed," I said, voice too steady, too controlled. He tilted his head slightly, studying me for a beat longer than necessary. Then he smirked again, that knowing expression that made my pulse stutter. "Good night then," he said, his voice smooth, easy, as if none of this was out of the ordinary. I turned on my heel and walked out, keeping my steps even, controlled, normal. But as soon as I was out of sight, my breath left me in a quiet exhale, my hands pressing against the cool surface of the hallway wall. Something was wrong. Not in a tangible way, not in a way I could explain, but I felt it deep in my bones. And worse, I had a feeling this was only the beginning. The tension crept in slowly, so subtly that at first I convinced myself it wasn't there. It was in the way his gaze lingered a second too long, the way my breath hitched when he passed too close behind me in the kitchen, the way my skin felt too warm when his fingers accidentally brushed mine. It was nothing, I told myself, just my mind playing tricks. Just the side effect of having someone new in the house, someone younger, someone who carried himself with an ease I hadn't seen in years. I ignored it, but it refused to be ignored. It was in the small moments, the ones that felt insignificant until I looked back and saw them for what they were. The first time it happened while I was cooking dinner, my hands busy chopping vegetables while he leaned casually against the counter, watching, his posture relaxed but his attention sharp. I moved to grab a plate and his arm lifted at the same time, his fingers brushing against my wrist. It was nothing, a fraction of a second, but my body betrayed me before my mind could catch up. A sharp inhale, a split-second pause, a heat that settled under my skin long after the moment passed. I didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge it, but I felt his gaze settle on me like he had noticed. The second time I was wiping the kitchen table after breakfast, moving quickly, focused on the task until he reached for the salt shaker at the exact same time I did. Our hands collided, and instead of pulling away immediately, he hesitated, his fingers grazing over mine before he finally let go. His lips curved slightly, just enough for me to notice, just enough to make my heart trip over itself. "Always in sync," he said, his voice laced with amusement, but there was something else there, something heavier, something I refused to name. I forced a small, polite smile, pretending it didn't mean anything, pretending I didn't feel a current in the air thick enough to suffocate. It was ridiculous. It was harmless. And yet, I was aware of him in a way I hadn't been before, in a way I shouldn't have been at all. It got worse at night, when the house grew quiet, when the world outside our walls slowed down, when my husband was still at work and it was just the two of us. It started innocently enough, casual conversations over tea, small talk that drifted into deeper territory before I realized it. He asked questions, the kind most people never bothered to ask. "If you could start over, would you?" The kind that made me pause, the kind that made me think, the kind that pulled me in without me realizing how deep I was sinking. I answered honestly, maybe too honestly, maybe in a way that I shouldn't have. He listened in a way that felt different, in a way that made me feel seen, in a way that made me remember a version of myself I had buried long ago. And then, without warning, he said something I wasn't ready for. "You're different than I expected." His voice was thoughtful, careful, like he was trying to decide if he should say more. I swallowed hard, pretending to be unaffected, pretending I didn't care what he meant. "Is that a good thing?" I regretted the question the second it left my mouth, but it was too late. He tilted his head slightly, studying me, the corners of his lips twitching like he knew something I didn't. "Yeah," he said after a beat, his voice low, unreadable. "It is." I laughed, not because it was funny but because I didn't know what else to do. I grabbed my empty mug and turned toward the sink, putting my back to him, needing space, needing air, needing something to stop the way my pulse hammered in my throat. This was dangerous. Not in any obvious way, not in a way I could point to, but in a way that made my hands unsteady, in a way that made me hyper-aware of every shift in the air between us. I could feel him still watching me, could feel the weight of it pressing against my spine. "I should head to bed," I said, my voice too even, too controlled. He didn't respond right away, and for a moment I wondered if he would stop me, if he would say something that would make it impossible to pretend none of this was happening. But then finally he nodded. "Yeah," he said, slow, deliberate. "Good idea." I left the room without looking back, without acknowledging the pull that had settled between us like an invisible thread. I climbed the stairs, stepped into my bedroom, closed the door and let out a shaky breath, pressing my hands against the cool wood. It was fine. It was nothing. I would keep my distance. I would ignore whatever this was. But as I slipped under the covers, as I stared at the ceiling in the dark, I knew deep down that a line had already been drawn. And I had just taken a step over it. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settled deep into the walls, wrapping everything in stillness. It was late, later than I'd realized, the kind of late that made time feel heavier, like the night itself had stretched longer than it should have. The dim light from the kitchen cast soft shadows, flickering against the countertops, and I sat at the table, fingers wrapped around a half-empty cup of tea that had long since gone cold. He sat across from me, elbows on the table, his hands loosely clasped, his gaze steady. We hadn't meant to stay up this long. It started with something simple, small talk, casual, harmless. But somewhere along the way the conversation deepened, slipping into something more personal, something neither of us had intended. I told him things I hadn't told anyone in years, things I hadn't even said out loud to myself. He listened, not just out of politeness but like he actually wanted to understand. His eyes never drifted, never glazed over, never filled with the vacant indifference I'd grown used to. It was unsettling in a way I couldn't explain, in a way that made me feel seen in a way I wasn't sure I wanted to be. He told me things too. Dreams that never quite fit reality, expectations that felt like chains, the kind of disappointments you don't admit out loud. He spoke about the weight of them, how they pressed down in ways that were hard to explain. I nodded because I understood, because I felt it too, because I had carried that same weight in different ways. There was something almost dangerous in how easy it was to talk to him, in how words spilled out effortlessly, in how I didn't have to filter them or dress them up into something easier to digest. At some point, the conversation slowed, the words tapering off into something quieter, something heavier, something that hummed beneath the silence. I don't know how long we sat there, not speaking, just breathing in the same space, caught in something neither of us knew how to name. And then he reached for my hand. It was slow, unhurried, deliberate, his fingers brushing lightly against my wrist before his palm settled against mine. It should have felt foreign, unnatural, wrong, but it didn't. It felt like a shift, like something that had been teetering on the edge for too long had finally tipped over. My breath caught, my pulse jumped, and for the first time since this thing, whatever it was, had started, I had no idea what I was supposed to do. I should have pulled away. I should have said something, anything to break the moment. Instead, I looked at him and he looked at me, and whatever distance had been left between us collapsed in an instant. His lips brushed mine before I even registered what was happening, a whisper of a touch, quick, sharp, like a spark catching fire. My body reacted before my mind did, leaning in before I could stop myself, before I could think, before I could remember all the reasons this shouldn't be happening. And then it was over. A second, maybe two, barely enough time for it to register, but somehow enough to change everything. I pulled back first, my breath unsteady, my hands gripping the edge of the table as if it could ground me, as if it could pull me back to reality. He didn't move, didn't say a word, just watched me, his expression unreadable, his breathing just as uneven as mine. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, thick with something I couldn't undo. I stood up too fast, my chair scraping against the floor, the sound slicing through the silence. My mind raced, screaming at me to leave, to get out, to put as much space between us as possible. I should go to bed, I said, my voice too thin, too strained, the words barely holding together. He didn't stop me. He didn't say anything. He just sat there watching as I turned and walked away, my steps too hurried, too uneven. I made it to my room before the shock truly settled in, before my brain caught up to what had just happened. I shut the door behind me, pressing my back against it, my hands shaking as I pressed them against my lips, as if I could erase the feeling, as if I could undo the last few minutes. My heart slammed against my ribs, my breathing uneven, the weight of my own actions crashing over me in waves. This was a mistake. A terrible, irreversible mistake. And yet, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to will myself to sleep, I knew one thing for certain. I didn't regret it. I told myself it was nothing. A lapse in judgment, a fleeting mistake, a moment that would dissolve as quickly as it had come. I told myself I would forget it, that I would wake up and everything would feel normal again, that the weight pressing against my chest would vanish with the morning light. But when I stepped into the kitchen the next day, he was already there, leaning against the counter, coffee mug in hand, eyes flicking up to meet mine the second I entered the room. And in that instant I knew, there was no forgetting, no pretending, no erasing what had happened. The air between us was different now, thick and charged with something unsaid, something inescapable. I didn't speak. I couldn't. I just walked past him, reaching for the coffee pot, my movements stiff, mechanical, overly controlled. I could feel his eyes on me, waiting, watching, but he said nothing, and I refused to look at him. I needed distance. I needed space. I needed to pretend that what happened the night before had been a dream, something my mind had conjured up in the haze of exhaustion. But the problem was, it wasn't a dream. It was real. It had happened. And now, every moment I spent in this house felt like walking across a tightrope, one misstep away from disaster. I decided right then and there that I would avoid him. It wouldn't be difficult. I was busy, my days filled with errands, responsibilities, obligations that had always kept me moving. I would go about my routine as if nothing had changed, as if he was just another guest, another temporary presence in my home. But the flaw in my logic was glaringly obvious. He wasn't just another guest, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, he was always there. Passing him in the hallway felt different now, an unbearable awareness prickling across my skin whenever we crossed paths. Sitting across from him at the dinner table became a test of endurance, my hands gripping my fork too tightly, my focus fixed on my plate, my every word measured, careful, deliberate. Even the simplest conversations felt like navigating a minefield, every sentence heavy with unspoken tension, every glance lingering a second too long. He didn't push, didn't say anything inappropriate, didn't act any differently than before. But that was the problem. He acted as if nothing had changed, as if the night before had never happened, as if the air between us wasn't crackling with something that neither of us dared to name. It was exhausting. And then there was my husband. He noticed the shift in me before I even realized I was acting differently. Not in any obvious way, he wasn't the kind of man who picked up on subtle emotional cues, but in the little things. How I hesitated when he kissed my cheek before heading to work. How I stared off into space during dinner, my mind lost somewhere else entirely. How I seemed more restless at night, tossing and turning, unable to find comfort in the bed we had shared for years. But he didn't question it. At first I was relieved. The last thing I needed was him asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. But then another thought crept in. Shouldn't he have noticed more? Shouldn't he have seen what was happening right in front of him? Shouldn't he have felt the growing distance between us? But he didn't. Or maybe he did and he just chose to ignore it, to chalk it up to stress, to assume that whatever was wrong would fix itself in time. Either way, the realization settled over me like a weight I couldn't shake. I had been slipping away long before any of this happened, and he had never even seen it. I told myself over and over that the kiss had been a mistake, that it had meant nothing, that it could never happen again. But my heart and my mind were at war. Because deep down, buried beneath the guilt, beneath the logic, beneath the overwhelming fear of what I was becoming, there was a small, undeniable truth. I didn't want to avoid him. I wanted to see him. And that terrified me most of all. I could feel the shift in the air long before he said anything. My husband had always been perceptive in his own way, and though he never liked to admit it, he noticed when something was off. Lately, there had been an undeniable distance between us, one I couldn't ignore, one I could no longer explain away with distractions. The tension had been building for weeks, and now it was palpable, hanging in the air, making every small conversation, every simple gesture feel strained. I had been slipping away from him in ways I couldn't control, and he had begun to notice, even if he hadn't fully understood why. The night he finally spoke up, his voice was softer than usual, laced with a quiet concern that I hadn't heard in a long time. "Is everything okay?" he asked, the words feeling heavier than they should have. It wasn't the kind of question he usually asked, not because he didn't care, but because it wasn't in his nature to pry, to dig deeper into things he wasn't ready to face. But tonight, something about the way I was pulling away seemed to make him uneasy, and in a strange way, his attention felt like a lifeline I hadn't known I needed. Without waiting for an answer, he suggested we go out, just the two of us, to reconnect, to remember who we were before the chaos of life had swallowed us whole. "Let's have a night for ourselves," he said, his voice light, but there was an undertone of something I couldn't quite place. I agreed reluctantly, not because I didn't want to, but because something inside me resisted. Yet as we made our way to a small restaurant, as we sat across from each other in the warm, dimly lit corner booth, a part of me wanted this. Wanted us. It was easy to pretend, to slip into old patterns, to laugh at old jokes, to reminisce about moments when everything had felt simple, when the world had revolved around us and nothing seemed so complicated. But as the evening wore on and the conversation deepened, I began to feel the weight of everything we hadn't said, everything that had been left unspoken, lingering between us like an uninvited guest. The wine seemed to loosen the edges of my thoughts, but it couldn't drown the uncertainty in my chest. When the check came, he reached across the table to take my hand, his fingers warm and familiar, and for the briefest moment, I felt the flicker of something we used to share, something I hadn't felt in what felt like forever. It was an instinctual gesture, simple but intimate, and for a moment I allowed myself to forget everything else, to pretend that we could pick up right where we left off. But as he leaned closer, as his lips brushed mine in a slow, deliberate kiss, I realized that everything had changed. The kiss was gentle, familiar, but it was tainted with something I couldn't ignore. It felt like a memory, like an attempt to recreate something that was lost. The warmth of his lips against mine was soothing, but it didn't stir the emotions it used to. Instead, it made me painfully aware of the distance between us, the space that had grown in the quiet moments, in the spaces where we had once filled each other's silences. As we pulled away, I could see the hope in his eyes, the quiet expectation that things would be the same again, that the kiss would bring us back to where we were. But inside I felt a gnawing sense of loss. The connection was there, but it was faint, flickering like a dying ember. And in that moment, I understood something that I had been refusing to face. I wasn't the same person anymore, and neither was he. Our kiss, the one that had once sealed promises and ignited passions, felt like a goodbye now, a final attempt to hold on to something slipping through our fingers. He smiled as if he hadn't noticed the difference, as if everything had gone back to normal, but I knew better. The kiss had been a lie, not because it wasn't real but because it was rooted in a past that no longer existed. The love was there, somewhere beneath the surface, but it wasn't enough to make up for the emotional space that had taken root between us. And as I walked back to the car, my hands still loosely intertwined with his, I realized that there was no turning back from this. Not anymore. I told myself I would keep my distance. It wasn't just for my sake, it was for everyone's sake. The house, already filled with the lingering tension of unspoken words, needed to return to its normal rhythm. I had my responsibilities, my duties, and I couldn't let this pull between us derail everything I had built. So I avoided him. I forced myself to be distant, to pretend I didn't notice when he stood too close, when his voice dropped lower, when his smile lingered a little too long. But it wasn't working. He didn't back off. In fact, it seemed like he was only more determined to stay near me, to insert himself into my daily life in subtle, almost unnoticed ways. At first it was innocent enough. A casual comment about the weather, a question about what I was making for dinner, a suggestion to go on a walk together. Little things that didn't mean anything, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. But each time I could feel the air between us tighten, like the space was shrinking with every passing second. Every time he appeared in the kitchen while I was preparing a meal, I could feel the pressure building, as if he were drawn to me by some invisible force that neither of us could fight. And each time I forced myself to act like it was nothing, like the heat I felt rising in my chest was nothing more than a trick of the light. But it wasn't a trick. It was real. I couldn't pretend anymore. One evening I found myself walking down the hallway on my way to the laundry room. I was thinking about the pile of clothes I needed to sort, the phone call I had to make, the list of things I hadn't yet done. But as I turned the corner, there he was, standing right in the narrow space between the wall and the staircase, so close that I nearly collided with him. His gaze met mine before I had a chance to step back, and for a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The air felt charged, thick with something I couldn't name, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. His hand brushed mine as he stepped to the side to let me pass, and it was like a spark had flown between us, a jolt that shot through my veins. My heart beat faster, my breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't look away from him. I should have said something, should have pulled away, should have broken the moment. But I didn't. Instead I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of the sudden, overwhelming rush of emotions. His lips parted slightly as if he was about to speak, but he didn't. He just watched me, his gaze steady, unreadable, and for the first time I wondered if he felt it too. Later, in the kitchen, he was there again, his presence like an electric current filling the space, making it impossible to ignore him. He leaned against the counter, casually stirring his coffee, but his attention never left me, and I couldn't stop the pull I felt toward him. Every word he said seemed loaded with meaning. Every glance between us felt like it carried more weight than it should. When he asked if I needed help with anything, his voice was low, deliberately soft, and it made something tighten in my chest. I wanted to tell him no, to tell him to leave, to tell him I wasn't some prize to be won, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, too aware of how close we were standing, of how his shoulder brushed against mine as we moved around the kitchen, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. The atmosphere in the house felt different now, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't escape it, couldn't ignore the tension that had settled into every room, every corner. It was inevitable, like a storm waiting to break, and no matter how much I told myself I was doing the right thing, no matter how hard I tried to push him away, I knew I couldn't stop it. Because deep down I didn't want to. And that was the scariest part of all. It was late, much later than usual, and the house was still, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old clock on the wall. I had long since finished dinner, cleaned the kitchen, and even settled in with a book that I hadn't been able to concentrate on for weeks. The silence was suffocating, the kind of quiet that makes every creak of the house sound louder than it should be. My husband was still at work, the late nights becoming more frequent, and as much as I tried to convince myself that it was just part of his career, a part of me was starting to wonder if it was more than that. The weight of the hours stretched on, and I was left alone with my thoughts, which had become unbearable. I had spent days avoiding him, pushing down every feeling that made its way to the surface, but tonight, it seemed impossible to avoid. It was like the universe had conspired to bring us together in this moment, the tension between us thicker than ever. When he walked into the room, I had already heard his steps, and yet I still couldn't breathe. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his presence filling the space between us. We had spent so much time avoiding this, so much time pretending that nothing had changed, but now, in the dim light of the hallway, the truth was undeniable. He looked at me, eyes searching, not the way he had before, not the casual glances we had exchanged, but with a directness that cut through the silence like a knife. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, measured, but there was no mistaking the urgency in it. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I had been waiting for this moment, for this conversation, but I hadn't expected it to come like this, in the dead of night, when everything felt like it was hanging by a thread. I nodded, unable to speak, and without another word he walked into the living room and I followed, my steps slow, hesitant. When we sat down across from each other, there was no hiding the distance between us. It was too wide, too much, and the silence in the room felt like it was suffocating me. He didn't waste any time. "I can't keep pretending like I don't know what's going on," he said, his words deliberate, heavy. I swallowed hard, the truth finally coming to light. "What are you talking about?" I asked, even though I knew exactly what he meant. His eyes didn't leave mine, and for the first time, I saw something raw in them, something vulnerable that I hadn't seen before. There's something happening between us and you can't pretend it's not there. We both know it." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, all I could do was stare at him, trying to comprehend the truth of it. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just nodded, too tired to deny it anymore. It had been building for weeks, months even, but tonight it was too much to hold inside. "I didn't want this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but the confession felt like it was ripping me apart. "But it's too late now." He didn't look surprised, didn't seem angry or hurt, just resigned, like he had been waiting for me to say it. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes softening. "I know," he said quietly. "I know it's too late. But we can't keep pretending like everything's fine when it isn't." The words hung between us, and in that moment I realized just how much we had been fooling ourselves. All the distance, all the avoidance, all the excuses, it had all been to protect ourselves from the inevitable. But the inevitable had arrived, and there was no turning back. The room was filled with a strange, painful quiet as I fought to keep myself together, to hold on to the part of me that wanted to pretend everything was still normal. But there was no pretending now. The walls between us had come down, and for the first time, I allowed myself to feel everything that had been bubbling beneath the surface. The guilt, the shame, the fear, and the desire. It all crashed over me in a wave, and I didn't fight it. I couldn't. I had been lying to myself for so long, and now there was no way to deny the truth anymore. The finality of it hit me like a punch to the stomach, and I was left with nothing but the weight of my own choices. He didn't say anything more, and neither did I. We just sat there, the silence stretching on, thick with everything that was left unsaid. And even though I knew that nothing would ever be the same again, I couldn't bring myself to leave. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure if I even wanted to. I had known for days, perhaps even weeks, that I had crossed a line I couldn't erase. Each moment between us had pushed me further past a point I couldn't return from, and yet, as much as I tried to pretend otherwise, the truth lingered like a shadow, impossible to escape. I could feel it in the way my heart beat faster when he was near, in the way my thoughts scattered whenever he looked at me with those eyes that made everything else fade into the background. I had tried to distance myself, to pretend that nothing had changed, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. And neither could he. Tonight I had promised myself it would be different. I would stay away, keep my distance, push back the emotions that had been slowly consuming me, but as I sat across from him talking about nothing and everything at the same time, it felt like the walls were closing in. We were talking, or maybe it was more like we were simply existing in the same space, our words hanging between us, thick with unspoken things. I knew it was too late, that the inevitable was only a matter of time, but I couldn't stop it. Not this time. Not when everything inside of me was screaming to let it happen, to just give in and stop pretending. And that's when I heard it. The sound of the front door opening, a soft creak that echoed in the otherwise quiet house. My heart lurched in my chest, my eyes darting toward the hallway, and I felt my stomach drop. The door opened fully, and I didn't need to see his face to know it was my husband. His footsteps echoed through the house, slow but deliberate, each one sending a shockwave of dread through my body. He had come home early, earlier than I expected, earlier than I had hoped. For a split second the world seemed to stop and I could feel time stretch out, feel the tension coil tighter, the weight of what was happening settling heavily between us. I stood up quickly, my legs unsteady beneath me, but I couldn't make myself move fast enough. His face appeared in the doorway and I saw it all at once. The confusion, the surprise, the hurt, but most of all, the realization that had begun to form behind his eyes. He didn't say anything at first, didn't speak a word, but his presence in the doorway, his gaze fixed on us, made it clear that the truth had finally caught up with us. I opened my mouth to say something, anything to explain, to make it seem like it wasn't what it was, but no words came out. Instead I just stood there, frozen, my body cold despite the warmth of the room. He didn't shout, didn't explode, but his silence was louder than any words could have been. His face didn't twist with anger, but it was like something in his expression cracked, something deep inside that I hadn't seen before. He looked from me to him, back to me, as if searching for an explanation, as if expecting something to make sense of what he was seeing. But there was nothing. There was no explanation, no justification, nothing that could undo the mess we had created. His gaze lingered on me for a moment longer and then without a word he turned and walked away. His footsteps, slow but purposeful, faded down the hallway, and I could feel the weight of his departure like an anchor sinking into my chest. I wanted to run after him, to beg him to stay, to tell him everything would be okay, but I couldn't move. I couldn't bring myself to do anything but stand there, feeling everything I had tried to ignore crashing down around me. It was over. I didn't know how it had happened or when, but I knew it in that moment. I had crossed a line and now there was no way to undo it. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence stretching between us like a chasm, and then I heard the door close. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it echoed through me like the finality of everything I had been avoiding. I stayed where I was, unable to bring myself to move, to speak, to fix it. It was too late. Everything was too late. The change in him was immediate and unmistakable. It wasn't the kind of coldness that appeared all at once like a storm rolling in, but the kind that crept in slowly, settling between us like a shadow that I couldn't shake off. At first it was subtle. He stopped looking at me the way he used to, the way that made me feel seen, cared for, important. He began to keep his distance, not just physically but emotionally as well. The warmth we had shared, the connection that had once bridged every gap was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar, something colder, something that I couldn't reach. I told myself it was fine, that he just needed time, that everything would be okay once the initial shock had worn off. But the days stretched on, and with each passing hour the space between us grew wider. It wasn't just the way he avoided looking at me or the way he no longer kissed me goodbye in the mornings. It was the silence. The silence that filled every room we occupied together. The kind of silence that made even the simplest conversation feel like an impossible task. The silence that screamed louder than any argument could. I could feel him in the same space, but he wasn't really there. I wasn't really there either. I knew he knew. It wasn't a question anymore. He had figured it out, seen the cracks, felt the distance, and it had all caught up to us, like a storm we had both been avoiding. It had arrived and there was no escaping it. The unease that had settled in my chest never left. The guilt, the shame, the regret, it all lingered in the corners of my mind, feeding off the growing tension between us. I knew he was waiting for me to address it, to say something, to explain myself, but I didn't have the words. There was nothing I could say to make it right. The weight of it hung over everything, tainting every moment we shared. I tried to keep up appearances, tried to pretend that nothing had changed, but I could feel the lie in my bones. And so, we went on like this, each day a little colder, a little more distant, until one evening he finally spoke. His voice was quiet, controlled, the kind of calm that only made the words sharper. "We need to talk," he said, and it was everything I had been avoiding, everything I had been dreading. I nodded, my throat tight, my breath shallow. I had known this moment was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. He didn't shout, didn't raise his voice, didn't even look angry. But when he spoke, his words cut through me like a knife. "I know what's been happening," he said, his eyes locked on mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt his gaze like a weight pressing against me. "I don't need you to tell me. I can see it. I can feel it." His voice trembled just slightly, but it was enough to make me ache. "You've been slipping away and I've been pretending it doesn't bother me, pretending that maybe it's something we could get through, but it's not. It's not something I can ignore. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came. I didn't have anything to offer. I didn't know how to make it better. I don't need a scene, he continued, his voice steady but laced with something I couldn't place. I just need you to understand what this means. It's not something I can just brush off. You've broken something and I don't know how to fix it. The silence that followed was suffocating, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a vice. I could feel the room closing in, the reality of what I had done settling over me. He didn't yell, didn't demand anything from me, but his words were enough to rip through everything I had been pretending to hold together. The finality in his tone, the coldness in his eyes, it told me everything I needed to know. He was done. I wasn't sure when it had happened, when things had shifted, but I understood now that I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. I had broken something inside of him, something I couldn't fix, something I couldn't undo. And as much as I wanted to reach out, to apologize, to make it right, I knew it was too late. The damage was done, and no amount of words could erase what had already been shattered. We were both too far gone. And as I stood there, the weight of his gaze heavy on me, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The silence returned, thicker now, suffocating, and all I could do was stand there, knowing that I had broken something that could never be fixed. He didn't give me a chance to explain, didn't offer any words of comfort or even sympathy. He just made his decision as if it had already been decided long before that moment, when the silence between us had grown unbearable and the cracks in our lives had become too large to ignore. He told me quietly, calmly, as if he had been expecting this, that he needed space, that we needed space. His voice didn't tremble, didn't crack. It was steady, as if he had already accepted the truth of it. I think it's best if we take some time apart, he said, his eyes avoiding mine, focusing instead on the floor, on the walls, anywhere but on me. I need to think. We both do. And just like that, the world I had known, the world I had relied on, began to crumble. There was no shouting, no accusations, just an inevitable finality that settled in the air between us, thick with the weight of everything I had destroyed. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my body go cold as I stood there, motionless, unable to process what was happening. You can't just walk away, I whispered, the words slipping from my lips before I could stop them, but I knew, even as I said it, that he had already made up his mind. He wasn't walking away. He was already gone. The life we had built together, the comfort, the predictability, it was all slipping away. Everything we had once shared, everything that had held us together, was being erased, and I had no one but myself to blame. I tried to argue, tried to find the words that would bring him back, that would convince him that we could fix this, but my words fell flat, meaningless in the face of the cold truth that hung in the air between us. I think it's best if I leave for a while, he said, his voice firm, final, and with those words he sealed our fate. My mind raced, trying to come up with something, anything that could change his mind, but nothing came. I had lost him. I had lost us. He packed his things quietly, methodically, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except watch as he walked out of our shared life, leaving behind only silence in his wake. The sound of the door closing behind him was deafening, a final punctuation on the end of everything. I stood there in the empty room, feeling the space between us grow larger with each passing second, and I couldn't help but wonder when things had gone wrong. When we had stopped being the couple that once laughed together, the couple that had promised forever. Was it just the years, the distance that had slowly crept between us? Or had something else broken, something deeper than I could have known? It didn't matter anymore. It was too late. The silence in the house now was oppressive, suffocating, as if the walls themselves had witnessed the destruction and were mourning it with me. My thoughts kept circling back to the other mistake I had made, to the younger man who had come into our lives like a storm, like an irresistible force that had thrown everything off course. He too had started as something innocent, something I told myself would pass, but now I knew it had been more than just a passing distraction. It had been real, too real, and the consequences were the same. There was nothing left to salvage, nothing that hadn't been irrevocably damaged. And now, sitting alone in the house we had once shared, the house that no longer felt like a home, I realized the full weight of what I had done. I had risked everything for fleeting moments, for emotions that had burned bright and fast, but now as I sat there in the cold emptiness I understood. I had lost everything. The man I had married, the life we had built, the trust that had once held us together, it was all gone, shattered by my own hands. The house was silent, the air thick with the weight of my own mistakes, and as I sat there, I felt the truth settle deep within me. I had crossed a line and now there was no going back. I had lost it all and there was no way to undo the damage. This was the price I had paid for my moment of weakness, and as I stared at the empty rooms around me, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The finality of it crashed down on me like a tidal wave, and I could only sit there alone, with the overwhelming sense of irreversible loss.